Quite often when you write a code which is supposed to be used by somebody else, and for instance you design it so that it has in some places the input function, so that the user would pass in the values he or she wants for the code to be used rather than you predefining the parameters or variable values. So in this case, if the user doesn't follow the instructions you gave with the data type, even though your code is written correctly, it may crash, so it will give some errors. And if you want to prevent it, you can use some of the predefined isSomething functions, which can check whether the user's input is actually correct or is it meeting the standards or the data type that you need for the task. So we have looked at one of those already, and that one was isNone. So this was when we looked at whether some data was actually missing in our data set. But there is quite a few more in Matlab, and I'll show you some of those most common ones that are used especially for checking data type. So the three most common ones are isChar, isEmpty, and isNumeric. So isChar, it verifies whether the variable is a string of characters. So what does it mean? If we apply isChar on any text, so you see here with the quote mark that defines that we are having text array, then it should return 1 when it really is a string array. If you apply isChar on numeric value, then it should return 0, and that numeric value can also be bigger. So you can have isChar on, for instance, a matrix. So that should also give you 0. And then isChar on none, so the not a number, is also 0, because remember that not a number is actually numeric way of saying that something cannot be calculated, or something is undefined, but in the numeric category. The second one is isEmpty. So this one is for identifying whether an array which was inserted, or maybe is a result of some calculation, whether it's empty. So that it is an array, but it doesn't contain any values inside. So isEmpty on an empty array, of course, returns 1. If you remember, this is how we define empty array, empty brackets, square brackets. Then isEmpty on a text string should return 0, because this is an array which is not empty, it has 7 objects inside. And then isEmpty on any numeric matrix should return 0, and also, for instance, if our numeric array has only non-values, be it 1 or many, this would also return 0 if we ask isEmpty. And finally we have isNumeric. Sorry, there is a mistake. So not whether it has any elements, it checks whether it is a numeric array, basically. So this is not true. Checks whether an array is numeric. So what does it mean? If we apply isNumeric on an empty array, this actually returns 1, because if you predefine vector to be empty, by default Matlab expects it to become a numeric array. It may happen that actually in the end it will not be numeric, because you will be putting in, for instance, strings. So if you create something like this, and then hi, for instance, then A becomes non-numeric. But as long as it's just empty initially, whatever your intention is to do later with it, Matlab doesn't know it and it assumes it will be numeric. So that's why isNumeric of empty arrays is 1. isNumeric of a numeric array, of course, is 1, and that regardless of the length, is it just one value, or is it many of them, is it a vector, is it a multidimensional array, that will be 1. And also if it contains not a number values. And finally, isNumeric of any text will always give you 0. So, for instance, here isNumeric applied on this one would give you 1, but on this one that would already be 0. So now if we would like to use it in some specific cases, so as I said before, those functions can be used when assuring that any user of our script or function will provide a proper input for calculation. And quite often, this kind of verification of input needs to be combined smartly within a while loop and the input function, so that the code would keep asking for input as long as it doesn't get what would satisfy our needs for the calculation. So a simple example here. We ask the user, or I mean, we decide to write a script which asks for one number as input, and then if the number equals 10, it assigns x equals 0. If the number is greater than 10, it assigns 1, and if it's less than 10, it assigns -1. And we want to display the result in command window. So it may happen that the user, instead of giving a number, will, for instance, press enter or type in some text or insert an array instead of a single number. So this may bring for us some problems. And how do we resolve it? So first we ask user for that input and we say, A, give a number. So whatever gets inserted by the user goes into variable A. But then before we do, because now this is the piece of code which should do the job that our task wants to do. But before we go there, in between, we insert a check. And so we say that in case what the user has inserted is not numeric, so if isNumeric of A returns 0, or, notice that this is an or, what the user has inserted is empty, so isEmpty of A is 1, or, once again, maybe the user has inserted something bigger than a single number. So remember, length returns, even if we have a matrix, it always returns the size of the longer dimension. So even a vector 1 by 2 or 2 by 1, already the length is 2. So as long as at least one of these, that's why there is or, if there is at least one of these creating a problem for our calculation, then we ask for the input again. So we can again ask for input, call input function, insert the text and say the input is not correct, try again. And so the new value goes again to A, and Matlab will keep checking and running this loop as long as it actually gets a numeric value for A. So let's try and put it in the code. So once again, we asked for input. And then we want to keep checking. So while, so as long as maybe A is not numeric, so isNumeric of A is 0, this means it's not numeric, or isEmpty of A is 1, or length of A is greater than 1. So if any of these happens, we use input and say try again. And Matlab will leave this loop only when it gets the value it is happy with, and only then we can do our if else. So then if A is greater than 10, x is 1, else if A equals 10, x is 0, and else x is -1. So let's run it and see how it behaves. Give any number. If I give a number, then of course Matlab doesn't even enter this loop because none of these conditions is satisfied. So when all are not satisfied, it just omits it and it goes directly into our if. But now if I break this rule, so for instance, I insert an array, so it says try again because it checked that the length is too long. When I press enter, so if you have this kind of input waiting and you press enter, this means that the input you gave is empty. So actually, now it again asks me to try again. And then we also had if it's not numeric, so if I insert some kind of text, then it also says try again. But then when I insert some value, then it has done the job. So it will keep asking as long as it takes. And in the same way, you can, for instance, when you say give a number, if you want the user to be able to quit the code, you can just, for instance, allow that when they press enter without inserting anything, that's when they quit. So for instance, you add here, add just enter or press enter if you want to quit, and then you somehow include this condition here in the code. So then if we go to another example, for instance, there are other restrictions you can add. So for instance, if we write a function which will create the first n Fibonacci numbers with n given by the user, so we want to prevent n from being, for instance, non-integer, because we want it to be a natural number, anything 1, 2, 3, 4 up to infinity, but an integer. We don't want it to be empty. We don't want it to be negative, we don't want it to be more than a single value, and we don't want it to be a text. So a code would look like this. Once again, now for instance, this is already written to be a function, and you can notice that I didn't put any input arguments. I could have also left empty brackets, because the only input argument which is needed for this is our value of n, how many numbers we want. But instead of passing it here as an input argument, we have kind of embedded it within our function that Matlab will keep asking for that input. So then again, we asked for the input first. Remember that in this case the loop is designed so that it will start working only when the first input comes from outside our function or outside our loop. So that's why the first ask for n happens before the loop, and then it may happen again in case this input is not correct. So then how do we have it all combined? We said that we want it to be an integer. So this is how I decided to check, because a number is an integer, for instance, when you round it, it still equals itself. So in here I say that in case n is not equal its rounded version. So not in Matlab is done with this tilde sign, so this would mean that in case it is not equal, or n is negative, or in case it's empty, or in case it's not a single number, or in case it's not numeric. If any of these four happens, or actually five, there are 5 conditions, if any of these 5 happens, then Matlab will ask for the number again. And then there comes just the creation of the Fibonacci numbers. So it is that straightforward. And the number of these conditions in here can be as long as you need, as long as you like, and depending on the types of conditions, you may also sometimes need to use AND, but that really is always case specific.